You know, folks, we have told a whole lot of stories in our time here on YouTube. Um, this one's an interesting story. It's part of history and actually quite a bit of local folklore for the folks over in Harlan County, Kentucky. Not only that, it involves hollow trees, it involves witchcraft, it involves lots of marriages, and it's a, I don't know, would you call it a fun story, Rod?
I would say so. I call it a story of longevity.
I think that's a good title for it.
Okay. Yeah, I would call that a wonderful case of longevity if you really wanted to call it that. So,
Now, this fellow's name is George Burkhart, and he's pretty well known in Harlan County as being one of the earliest settlers to that part of Kentucky. He came, well, according to the story, there's a couple of different stories, okay? One story has it that George Burkhart was born in southern Germany in 1725. And he migrated to the United States, to Pennsylvania, lived up there for a spell, moved down to Virginia for a while, and then in sometime around 1810, he moved over the mountains into Kentucky, where he settled in Harlan County. But, Rod, there was a housing shortage. And because of that, he and his family had to move into, yes, a hollow sycamore tree.
wow.
Can you believe that? Now,
Oh, that'd have to be a pretty darn big sycamore tree.
well, it was. According to the stories that's been told, it was big enough, let me see here, big enough that they could cook and sleep in it. It
Wow.
was pretty much like this. They had this humongous sycamore tree, and I guess it must have been part of the virgin forest. But they could put two beds in it, kitchen table, chairs, utensils, stuff like that. And then he built a roof over the top of it. And that's where they lived for a little while until he managed to get his hands on some land and he built a cabin. Now, this fella lived until 1850. So do the math, Rod. 1725 to 1850 would be how old?
Well, I'm not a math major, but I'd be about 125 years old.
That's the story that's been told.
Wow.
Now, is that true or not? I don't know, but we're going to go ahead and tell you some more about these legends. And there's several different stories about this that we're going to get into. Now, one of those legends has to do with his wives. His first wife, while they were living in the hollow sycamore tree, one day a bear tried to catch one of their sheep. They had some sheep around there. So she went over the fence and into the enclosure. The bear rushed onto the fence, and while it was trying to climb over the brush, Mrs. Burkhart shot and killed it.
Wow.
Well, that takes some bravery right there. She did pass away not long after that. Don't think it had anything to do with the bear.
Right.
And Mr. Burkhart married again at the age of 118 to a 35-year-old.
Oh, my gosh.
According to this story, quote, he danced that night to the tune of some old ballads of some of the old-time fiddlers. Now, they didn't stick around together too long. They ended up breaking up, and then he lived the rest of his life alone and then died at the age of 125. That's one of the stories.
Right.
Here's the thing. There are some websites out there that do genealogy. One of those is WikiTree. And on WikiTree, there is a George Jacob Burkhart, who was born in Switzerland in 1703 and immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1739. He married a woman there in 1741, and we don't know when he died, but he had a son named George Burkhart Jr., who was born in 1742, served in the Revolution, and then came to Kentucky to Harlan County.
Okay.
So the guy really wasn't quite as old. He was old. He was an old fellow when he died, but he wasn't 125. Lord, there's so many different stories here, Rod. Why don't you tell the one that came out of that newspaper clipping that I gave you?
Well, basically what you were talking about earlier, and that was, born in southern Germany, or lower Germany, at least is what they said, sometime around 1725, coming to Pennsylvania and so forth. But when he got to Virginia, he had 5 children after he had married and so forth. His wife then died, and then in 1 year, he married his second wife from Virginia. And this is what's interesting, too. He married her in the year 1800. And then removed his family to the state of Kentucky, then Knox, what is now Harlan County, Kentucky, on Cranks Creek of the Cumberland River. Now, all this sounds, pretty good and stuff, but then it goes back to that same thing what Steve was talking about, and that's the large hollow sycamore tree where he and his family resided for many years, and where many of his children were born and raised. Now, it was, get this, they've got a little bit more here. The tree was 15 feet in diameter. That's huge. Okay. It was also forked off into 2 or 3 different kinds of branches or so forth, or trunks, however you want to call it. The nearest fork from its base was 20 feet with broken off and was hollow and served as the chimney. And the household furniture in the tree consisted of 2 beds, bed clothing, table, cooking utensils, and all the stuff that you'd need, plus some ordinary furniture out of the early settler from this country and so forth. But then, like I said, his wife died. This is what I feel like is interesting. He had, although moved to Kentucky, he comes back, or so to speak, he marries someone on the Virginia side. He marries this time a woman by the name of Miss Elizabeth Graybeale. And some of you will know that name quite familiar, because Graybeale, I think, is still a name that's quite prominent in Lee County, I think, even to this day. But she was 65 years old. But that didn't last very long, did it, Steve?
No, she died at the age of 70, so they only had 5 years together. That's when, at 110, he found a new bride, Lavinia Morris, of the ripe old age of 35.
Wow. Talk about cradle robber.
Well, yeah. Speaking of cradles, I think folks were hoping he would have another child, but sadly, that was not to be, for they did not get along. I would assume that she probably looked at him and figured, why don't you die already so I can inherit your stuff? And he didn't do it, so they split up.
Well, too, look at it. 110 years old, but here he is, and she's 35. Let's not say cradle robber. More like a womb robber was what it was, because she hadn't even, she was barely 35 years into her age, and then here he is, 110. But like you said, they couldn't get along. They had a very unhappy marriage, and then they kind of went their own way and so forth.
Well, here's where it gets even more interesting. Supposedly, after that, he swore off women. He said, 110 years, that's enough for me.
Right.
So guess what he did?
I don't know. What did he do?
He became a witch doctor, or sorcerer, as some would say. So from what they say, for miles and miles around, from Tennessee, from Virginia, folks would be calling on him to come over and take care of any bewitchment of their cows and their horses and things like that. And they said that he was very good at it. One of the things he did, and this is an old bit of folklore, in order to rid somebody of a witch, he would draw a picture of that person and put it on a tree and shoot it, which then would take care of said witch permanently. So that's what they said. Anyway, he died in 1850 at the age of 125. His son lived to be 90 years old. So a very long-lived family.
Hey, but that's not all either.
No, it's not.
The marriage and so forth. This is what gets me. Okay? In his life, he cut a new set of teeth.
Yeah.
Cut a new set of teeth. Regained his eyesight. His eyesight was as good as it was when he was a boy. when he was over 100 years old. Now, how do you go and how do you cut a new set of teeth? That's just unreal to me.
Well, I guess you live long enough that eventually something grows back in, I suppose. The eyesight thing is the odd part. I mean, I could see the teeth if by
Right.
some chance a set of teeth popped up, but the eyesight, how would your eyesight get better
Right.
over years? I don't know. And again, we don't know if any of that is true.
Right.
We only know that there was a George Burkhart who moved to Harlan with his family, moved into a hollow tree. That is true. What the tree was like was a sycamore tree is all we know. We don't know anything about it, but best guess that we can determine is that he actually built a roof over that stump, and that's where they lived temporarily until they bought some land and built a cabin. Other than that, these are all stories that have been told over the years. Judges have told these stories back in the 1800s. Newspapers wrote about him from Nashville, from New York, talking about him dying in 1850. Said he was the oldest man in the world, 125, although, as I said, it probably was his son and not
Right.
him. They just combined the two lives together. They do that quite a bit. It'd be interesting to go back in time to talk to him and just see if any of this, I mean, he could have been a witch doctor. We don't know. But folks said that. This judge said that. There's some old history books that kind of point toward that too. But every one of these stories, though, has a different bit of the story to it, slightly different. So we don't know for sure what is factual and what is not. What's
Well,
just folklore.
To be honest with you, I grew up hearing about someone, an old man, who grew another set of teeth. But I never did know who it was, never heard of it or anything. And now this kind of drops in front of me, and it's kind of like, oh, it may have been this guy. But that was the story that kind of went around that, when you got so old, if you were lucky enough, you might cut another set of teeth. And that's just wild. But here we are, too. We talk about this thing of cutting teeth. Who would have ever heard of a baby still in the womb cutting teeth and having two teeth the time they were born? Now, I can say that about my granddaughter. She was like one in, I forget how many thousand chances or something like that of having teeth when she was first born. But, this is at 100 years old, or at least close to 100 years old. He goes and he grows another set of teeth and then gets his eyesight back, in addition to being married 4 times. Wow. What a man.
Yeah. Yeah. He was indeed quite a legend. You can just say that. And we want to thank a listener for sending this on to us. This is one of those stories, again, that folks recommended to us. If you all have a story that you would like for us to look at, tell us in the comments below. We'd like to see that and see if there's some other stories we can tell you. In the meantime, be sure to give us a thumbs up if you don't mind. Click that subscribe button down below, and we'll see you again next week. Y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.